Someone asked me to do a video on the 6.5 by 300 Weatherby. Whew! And while I was doing my research on that one, I thought, why don't we do a comparison between it and the 30-06? Well, a lot of people are going to call me crazy and say that I am comparing apples and oranges, but if you hang in there and listen to all these numbers, I think you are going to be shocked by how close the 30-06 comes to the 6.5 by 300 Weatherby. Whoo, baby, hang on tight. We're taking a road trip down Ballistic Lane. Now, first the 6.5 by 300 Weatherby. This is actually a Wildcat cartridge that was out long ago. I think Roy Weatherby himself came up with it, but he never made it a commercial option. It just thought it was a little bit over the top, shall we say. Now, to understand it, you have to understand the basic 300 Weatherby cartridge, probably the most famous and beloved of all the Weatherby Magnums. And that is simply the 300 H&H case that's had the wall straightened out quite a bit and the shoulder pushed forward for more horsepower. It is a full Magnum length cartridge. As you can see, it's a little bit longer than the 30-06 length. These are considered to be the standard length cartridges, 30-06, 270, 280, that's standard length. 308 and shorter are considered short actions, but the full Magnum actions, that's the 375 H&H and family. So they took that 300 and they necked it down and necked it down and necked it down to 26. And that's where they came up with the 6.5 by 300 Weatherby. So it is today the fastest, arguably the fastest 6.5 or 0.264 inch diameter bullet launching cartridge out there. It's a screamer, and we're going to look at some numbers. But how can I then even begin to suggest we compare it to the 30-06? Here's my point on that one. Why do we buy these cartridges? I don't know about you, but I buy them for hunting. Not too many people are going target shooting with a 6.5 by 300 because of the expense and the way it eats up barrels. Shoot, people these days don't target shoot all that much with the 30-06 either. Too much recoil, again, fairly expensive when you compare it against something inexpensive and easy to shoot like a 6.5 Creedmoor or a 6mm Creedmoor or even a 243 Winchester. So I would say these are both hunting cartridges. And what do we want a hunting cartridge to do? We want it to reach out and touch someone or something, and we want it to do the job when it gets there. So you have to have enough energy and a flat enough trajectory for reasonable hunting distances. There's the sticking point. What is an acceptable hunting range or distance? This is where we're going to find that 30-06 coming pretty close to the 6.5. Now let's get back to a little more history on the 6.5 by 300. I honestly don't know which year it was finally turned loose as a commercial cartridge by Weatherby, but I think it was only about 3 years ago. Should have looked that one up. You can do that yourself, but I think what you're going to find is that Weatherby saw the competition, and I'm guessing the one that really drove them was the 26 Nosler. Weatherby has always had the reputation for having the fastest cartridge in any caliber. They've got the fastest 25 with the 257. They have the fastest 300. Well, they had it for quite a while. I think they probably still do with their 30 by 378 Weatherby Magnum. But for a long time, that 300 was the champ. I think the 270 Weatherby Magnum is still the fastest 27. So you get the picture. They, I think, just said, you know what? We're not going to sit back on our heels and let this 26 Nosler outdo us. So there's your direct competition. And the 6.5s, of course, were going crazy. Everybody was buying various ones. Ever since 2007, when that little 6.5 Creedmoor came out, the 6.5s have become really popular. So why not have the fastest one? If you're not target shooting, you're just out there hunting big game and you want to really reach out and impress something, get the big ones, right? So that's kind of where this thing has landed. You know, it's not going to appeal to everybody. It's probably not even going to appeal to 10% of the hunters. But there are always a certain number of hunters out there who want the biggest, the baddest, the fastest, something along those lines. And you're sure looking at it with this 6.5 by 300 Weatherby. So I thought, let's just do some numbers on this cartridge and compare it to that well-known 6.5 Creedmoor that you either love or hate, and just get a good feel for what this thing can do. So what I did was I took 24-inch barrels for everything that I worked with here, and in addition to the Creedmoor as kind of a baseline, I threw in the good old Winchester 264 Winchester Magnum. And the reason was that that one in the 20th century was the Hot 26. Came out in 1958, I believe. And it was known as a real screamer back then, but it got in trouble for burning out barrels. It really isn't all that bad on barrels, but a lot of people were trying it on varmints and prairie dogs and stuff and just really running the rounds through it and getting it really hot. And that gave it that reputation for burning out barrels. Of course, you look at it now, you look at the powder volume compared to the 26 Nosler and the 6.5 300 Weatherby, and it looks like kind of a pussycat in comparison. Certainly not down there at the level of that 6.5 Creedmoor. But that's one we want to consider. So let's do some numbers. 6.5 by 300 Weatherby Magnum, I found could drive a 142 grain Nosler Accubon bullet. We're going to use that for all of these from a 24-inch barrel. I had to do a little bit of extrapolating and searching on the hand loading sites and the ammo sites to find what my top velocity is likely in these, and some of them use 26-inch barrels, so I had to kind of work things out. Figured about 35 to 50 feet per second for every inch of barrel you cut off to reduce those velocities. But I think I've come up with some pretty accurate numbers. So, top velocity I could find that looked reasonable, 3,308 feet per second for the 6.5 by 300. What will that give us for a maximum point-blank range? And this is based on a 6-inch diameter target. If we aim for the middle of it, we don't want to go more than 3 inches high in our trajectory, and then when we drop 3 inches below that, we're going to be at our maximum point-blank range, which happens to be 345 yards with this one. To get that, we zero the rifle at 290 yards. You'll see this here right on your chart. What does that do for us? Well, we're going to jump right out there to 400 yards. Drop, drift, energy. Those are the numbers going across. We are 8.3 inches low at 400 yards. We have 7 inches of wind deflection in a right angle 10-mile-an-hour wind, and we're hanging on to 2,277 foot-pounds of energy. That is pretty significant. Out at 600 yards, we're dropping 39 inches, 16.7 inches of wind deflection, still 1,828 foot-pounds of energy. And if you consider that often cited 1,500 foot-pounds of energy remaining in your bullet when you strike an elk is adequate for taking elk, we're more than adequate with this little bullet, only 142 grains, because of its velocity. Now, let's compare that to the closest competitor, 26 Nosler. It looks like that one's going to have 50 to 100 feet per second less velocity. You might be able to squeak a little more out, but I think I'm being fair by to give it 3,208 feet per second. That gives us 337 yards for your maximum point-blank range, where you can hold dead on your animal and still hit it. And the zero would then be 280 yards to achieve that. We are dropping 9.6 inches at 400 yards, about an inch and a half more than the 6.5 300 Weatherby does. We're going to get 7.4 inches of deflection, just not even a half-inch difference, and hang on to 2,133 foot-pounds of energy. I don't think the elk is going to know what's the difference on that one. Out at 600 yards, you start to see a little more spread between the two. You're dropping 42 inches compared to 39 in the Weatherby. You still have... No, it's 42.7 on that one. And then it's a 17.4 inches of deflection and 1,706 foot-pounds. So as you can see, either one of them probably going to do just fine. But now let's go to the good old 264 Winchester. Often reviled, but undeservedly so, I think. We were able to crank that one up 3,050 feet per second, 310 yards maximum point-blank range, 265 yards for the zero. That drops 12 inches at 400 yards. You're starting to get a little differentiation now from the big boys down to this one. But deflection is not all that different because, again, we're using the same bullet with the same BC, 142 grain Accubon. You're deflecting 7.9 inches, still hanging on to 1,913 foot-pounds of energy. Out at 600 yards, dropping 49.6 inches, deflecting 18.7 inches, and holding on to still 1,522 foot-pounds. So you could say legitimately that little old 264 Win Mag with a 142 grain bullet should be adequate for elk at 600 yards. That's pretty impressive stuff. I'm not recommending you all go out and start launching bullets at elk 600 yards away, but come on, let's face it, in this day and age, there are just a lot of hunters who are taking these longer range shots. For some of them, 600 yards, they don't even consider that to be long. I certainly do. Now, let's go down to this little 6.5 Creedmoor, which, well, a lot of people say is way too puny to be doing this kind of long range stuff. Well, you can get that thing going 2,800 feet per second with that bullet. That gives you 285 yards for your maximum point blank range, and you've got to zero that at 248 yards. That's going to drop 16 inches at 400 yards, deflect 8.9 inches, and retain 1,587 foot-pounds of energy at 400 yards. Guys, that's pretty impressive for a little pipsqueak cartridge like this. So I still don't recommend you be using that as your primary elk round, but this explains why so many people have good success with it. Go out to 600 yards, and oh boy, you're dropping 62.4 inches, deflecting 21.2, and you're hanging out to, wow, this is even surprising, 1,250 foot-pounds of energy out of that little thing. No wonder it's a fairly popular and effective cartridge. Folks who understand it and use it judiciously just really have good luck with it. But of course, our champion, based on all those numbers, is this 6.5 by 300 Weatherby Magnum. Now, where are you going to get better speed and flatter trajectories than any of these? Well, you still get it out of the 6.5, but you go to a lighter weight bullet. I thought, hey, let's try that, especially these days with all the great copper bullets out there. 127 grain Barnes, 129 grain Hammer, lots of good options, and those bullets really perform for deep penetration. So I took a 129 grain Hammer Hunter, which by the way Weatherby loads in that cartridge, and I got 342 yards for maximum point blank range, and I zeroed it at 295 yards to do that. Was able to push it 3,450 feet per second. Guys, we are jumping out there at some 220 swift velocities here. So with that, we're dropping the least of all of these, 7.7 inches at 400 yards, 8.4 inches of wind deflection, a little more wind deflection now than you had out of that heavier bullet. There's your ballistics coefficients at work. But you're still hanging out of 2,054 foot-pounds of energy at 400 yards. Jump out to 600, and now you're dropping 37.9 inches, 20 inches of wind deflection, but still 1,565 foot-pounds of energy. So even with a little 129 grain bullet, you are going to be pretty darn effective. Now, I brought up that 30-06. Here's where they're going to say, why are you comparing apples and oranges? I'm not. I'm comparing hunting cartridges. So let's take these other guys off the table and put these two head to head, different though they may seem. If our objective is to take game within reasonable ranges, let's just find out how well this 30-06 does. With today's loads, you can push 168 grain bullet, and we will use an AccuBond, and we can drive that 2,950 feet per second. That is the original 30-06 with a 150 grain bullet. Was only going 2,700 feet per second. This is a 168 grain bullet, and it's going 2,950 feet per second. Whoa! So we've got a lot of advantages these days that have sort of crept up on us with new powders and stuff. Zero that thing at 255 yards, and it will have a maximum point blank range of 298. Close enough, 300 yards. Just think of that. The fuddy-duddy old 30-06, that dog of a cartridge that so many kids think it is, and you are able to hold dead on a deer's chest out to 300 yards and hit it with this sighting system. That's pretty impressive. What does that bullet do when it gets there? You know, I can't tell you what it's going to do at 300 yards because I've stuck with 400, but at 400 yards, it's going to drop 14.6 inches and still drift only 10 inches in the wind, and hang on to 1,929 foot-pounds of energy. More than enough to be an elk killer. Use the right bullet, good solid controlled expansion. You're going to have deep penetration, plenty of energy when you get there. 600 yards on a 30-06, 58.6 inches of drop, And look at the 6.5 Creedmoor, by the way. That has 62.4 inches of drop. The old 30-06 shoots flatter than the 6.5 Creedmoor. And look at the deflection, 24 inches for the 30-06. Only 20 inches for that 6.5 Weatherby with a 129 grain bullet. But those aren't even all that far off, guys. And the retained energy at 600 yards for the 30-06, 1,452 foot-pounds of energy. This is why I have the chutzpah to put these two together and compare them. As hunting cartridges throwing effective bullets at reasonable hunting distances of 400 and 500 yards, and yes, if you want to stretch it 600, I think that's just maybe a little bit too far, but the 30-06 still has the potential to be a darned effective one. Now let's go for the ultimate here. We're going to take the numbers from the 6.5 by 300 with that 142 grain bullet at 3,308 feet per second again, and compare it directly to the 30-06 with 168 grain bullet. And you're dropping at 400 yards only 8.3 inches with the 6.5, 14.6 inches with the 30-06. So there's definitely an advantage there. But again, if you're using a laser rangefinder and you know your trajectory curve, you can dial your scope or use reticle line. I think you can easily compensate. And you have enough energy when you get there. 2,277 out of the 6.5 300, still 1,929 out of the 30-06. What about recoil differences? This might make or break it for some people. The 6.5 Weatherby with that 142 grain bullet, you're getting 33.9 foot-pounds of energy at a recoil velocity of 16.5 feet per second. That's kind of ouch for a lot of shooters. Compare that to the 30-06 with the 168 grain bullet, and you're down to 24.5 foot-pounds of energy on your shoulder. Oh, man, that's almost 10 less. And that is only going 14 feet per second for your velocity. So you're going to have a lot less recoil with your 30-06. There's an advantage. Now, if you want to go with that little 6.5 Creedmoor, once again, why a lot of people like this thing, that only has 15.1 foot-pounds of recoil energy at 11 feet per second. A mild shooter. These are some of the things you have to think about when you're buying rounds for hunting. And I know it's easy to just look at those biggest and baddest and drool because of all their superior numbers, but do they really matter? Are you really going to be able to take advantage of them? And then you've got to consider availability and cost. And a lot of guys jump me on this because I don't address it often enough. I figure you guys are big enough to make up your own mind about what you can afford, but you do need to consider it when you're shopping, when you're saying, yeah, I think I'll pick this one up. Sounds like a great cartridge. Wait a minute, what's the rifle going to cost you? What's the ammunition going to cost you? Are you going to be able to afford to even shoot that thing? So, what Weatherby is loading for this 6.5 by 300 right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different loads. They may add some, they may have already added some, but this is a pretty good selection. They have a 127 grain Barnes LRX bullet, great bullet, and they're driving that at 3,475 feet per second. They have a 129 grain Hammer all copper bullet, fairly similar, 3,450 feet per second. 130 grain Swift Sirocco, that is a lead core bonded bullet with a really thick jacket, great long-range bullet. I've used it a lot over the years, 3,429 feet per second. Then they jump up to 140 grain Hornady Interlac, more of a traditional bullet. I almost would call it a cup and core. It's got a little more mechanical advantage than that, but not huge, 3,275 feet per second. Finally, 156 Berger EOL Elite at 3,050 feet per second. And a lot of folks would say, ooh, 156 grain bullet on that 6.5 by 300. That's a big thumping moose bullet, right? Not really. You've got to consider the construction. The Berger EOL Elite bullet is designed for extreme range performance, not close range, hard hitting stuff. That bullet's just a little bit too frangible, I think, for close range work. So you want to consider that. Now, how much does this stuff cost? Well, for one thing, only Weatherby is loading it. I'd have not heard of anyone else loading for this 6.5 by 300. Could be wrong, double check out there, but this is kind of a Weatherby special. And Weatherby is charging for these various loads somewhere between $70 for the least expensive and $110 for the most expensive. That's their suggested retail price. So you pretty much know you're going to have limited opportunities to pick up ammunition. You're probably going to want to buy ahead of time direct from Weatherby or something and have your supplies stocked up, because you're not going to just run down to the local Walmart and pick a box up. So those are your considerations. Now, I don't get the idea that I'm thinking this 6.5 by 300 Weatherby is useless. It's silly. It's over the top. It's going to burn out your barrels, and don't get one. I don't care what you guys get. I mean, if someone offered me this particular rifle for a hunt, I wouldn't hesitate to do it, because it does sound like it's pretty fun and it can certainly get the job done. Over the years, I've enjoyed playing around with a lot of different cartridges and different rifles, and like so many of us, I guess you could say I'm a churner. I'll use one for a couple, 3 years, and then I'll go on to something else, just because it's fun to experiment. It's kind of like, I don't know, any hobby where you get different materials that you can work with. A lot of guys will churn cars. You'll get a different type of truck every other year or something. Trade them off, get new stuff. There's a lot of ways to play this game. But again, I just think it really is sensible for anybody considering these sorts of things to do their research ahead of time. All the sort of things we discussed here about your ballistic performance, and then an honest appraisal of, do I really need this? Is there a significant benefit? And it just seems to me that with these really high-end, top-of-the-line power horses, for real-world hunting, I just don't think they're certainly not necessary, but I don't even know if they're all that practical of a choice. But hey, if you want to be able to say, I'm the big dog on the block, you can do that if you've got a 6.5 by 300 Weatherby Magnum. Now, that's the story for now, guys. Let me know if you agree, disagree, or have a bone to pick. I certainly could have gotten some of my numbers wrong in here, but I tried real hard to get them straight for you. Next time we see each other, let me know what you're shooting, how fast it goes, how much it drops, and how far out you're shooting. I hope you're keeping all your game shots inside of 600 yards. Hope you hunt honest and shoot straight. See you next time.